At 6:42 on February 26, 1945, Pharmacist's mate second class George Wallen crouched inside a shallow crater of volcanic ash on Iwo Jima, watching his platoon push toward airfield number 3 through a shattered landscape riddled with Japanese mortars. He was 20 years old, 37 days into combat. 14 Marines from his company were already dead. Ahead of him rose Hill 362A, honeycombed with more than 500 interconnected caves. Every foot the Marines gained was paid for in blood. Wallen had come ashore 7 days earlier with Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines. The black volcanic sand stuck to everything: boots, weapons, skin. The sulfur stung his lungs with every breath. But worse than the smell was the sound, the screaming. Every push forward brought the cry he had been trained to answer. Corpsmen. The 5th Marine Division had been told this would be a 4-day fight. General William Rupertus himself had assured the men the island would fall quickly. That promise ended the moment they discovered what Colonel Kunio Nakagawa had carved into the island's volcanic stone. Underground hospitals, ammunition bunkers buried 20 feet deep, machine gun nests overlapping fields of fire so tightly that every approach became a killing zone. By February 26th, the 5th Division had already taken 3,000 casualties. Corpsmen were dying faster than the riflemen they tried to save. Japanese snipers had learned to spot the red crosses painted on helmets. They learned to listen for the word corpsman and aim for the voice that answered. In just 7 days, Wallen had treated 43 wounded men, sucking chest wounds, traumatic amputations, flamethrower burns. He carried morphine syrettes, sulfa powder, battle dressings, plasma, nearly 30 pounds of medical gear on his back, while the Marines around him carried rifles. The rules were clear. Corpsmen were unarmed. The Geneva Convention marked medical personnel as protected. The Japanese ignored Geneva entirely. They hunted corpsmen on purpose. 14 Navy hospital corpsmen had already been killed in Wallen's battalion. 22 more had been evacuated with serious wounds. At 7:15, Fox Company pushed forward again. Wallen followed 20 yards behind the assault line, scanning for the next man to fall. The terrain offered no mercy. Jagged ridges and deep ravines turned movement into a deadly maze. Marines slipped into gullies and vanished. Then the mortars began. Japanese observers on the high ground had perfect sight lines. The first round exploded 30 feet in front of Wallen. The second detonated 15 feet behind him. The third landed directly beside a rifleman, Corporal James McKenna. Wallen moved without hesitation. This was what he had trained for at Camp Pendleton. This was why he had volunteered for the Fleet Marine Force instead of a safe hospital billet in California. McKenna was alive, bleeding badly, torn by fragments. Wallen dropped beside him and went to work. Sulfa powder dusted into open wounds. Dressings packed tight. Hands moving fast, steady, practiced. Then he heard the sound every corpsman feared. The hollow thump of a Japanese knee mortar. If you want to see what happened when that grenade landed, hit the like button. It helps keep these forgotten stories alive. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Back to Wallen. The grenade struck 3 feet from where he knelt. He watched it bounce once in the black ash. 2 seconds. Maybe less. McKenna couldn't move. The nearest cover lay 15 feet away, across open ground. In that instant, Wallen faced a choice that would define everything that followed. Stay and die beside McKenna. Or run and live with abandoning a wounded Marine. The grenade detonated. The blast hurled Wallen sideways into the crater wall. His ears rang violently. The world went white. Then the pain came. Shrapnel tore through his left eye and cheekbone. Blood streamed down his face, mixing with sulfur and volcanic ash. McKenna was still alive. The grenade had missed him by inches. Now both men lay exposed, bleeding, as Japanese mortars continued to fall. Wallen's training took over. He could barely see out of his left eye, but his hands kept moving. The pain was overwhelming. But McKenna's injuries were worse. Bright arterial blood pulsed from his leg. Without a tourniquet, he would bleed out in minutes. Wallen forced his shaking hands into his medical kit. His left eye was gone as a source of vision. Everything on that side was dark, blurred, soaked with blood. But his right eye still worked. His hands still worked. And McKenna needed him now. At 7:23, Wallen cinched the tourniquet tight around McKenna's leg. The bleeding slowed. He dusted the remaining wounds with sulfa powder and packed them with battle dressings. working methodically as Japanese machine gun fire stitched the rim of the crater. Bullets cracked overhead. Mortar rounds detonated less than 50 yards away. Other corpsmen had seen the blast. Pharmacist's mate, third-class Robert Hayes, crawled forward under fire. One look at Wallen's ruined face told him everything. Both men needed evacuation, standard procedure. Back to the battalion aid station. Immediately. Wallen refused. Fox Company was still advancing toward Airfield No. 3, the most heavily defended ground on Iwo Jima. Corpsmen were already dying faster than riflemen. Every medic on the line mattered. Hayes could take McKenna. Wallen was staying. Hayes argued for half a minute. Then he stopped. No one could order a corpsman off the line. There was a volunteer. Everyone had chosen this ground. If Wallen decided to remain half-blind and bleeding, that choice was his. At 7:35, they lifted McKenna onto a stretcher. Four Marines carried him rearward through the ash while Hayes provided cover. Wallen stayed behind. Blind in one eye, bleeding freely, he watched Fox Company crawl forward through hell. By 8 o'clock, the adrenaline faded. Pain flooded back in waves. His left eye socket felt as if molten metal had been poured into it. The sulfa powder he had dumped onto his own wounds burned like acid. But Marines were still advancing, and Marines were still falling. At 8:15, another cry cut through the chaos. Corpsmen. This time it came from a neighboring platoon. Their own corpsman had been killed by a sniper 20 minutes earlier. Wallen climbed out of the crater and moved toward the voice. With only one functioning eye, his depth perception was gone. He stumbled over uneven volcanic rock, nearly falling twice. But he could still carry plasma. He could still pack wounds. He could still do his job. The casualty was Private First Class Thomas O'Brien, from Pittsburgh. Shrapnel had torn into his chest and abdomen. Air bubbled through a sucking chest wound. Without immediate treatment, O'Brien would drown in his own blood. Wallen sealed the chest wound with an occlusive dressing. Then he started a plasma infusion. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory taking over. Camp Pendleton. 6 months of drills. Every nightmare scenario rehearsed in California was now happening for real. As Wallen worked, Japanese mortars found their range again. The first round exploded 40 feet away. The second detonated 20 feet out. The third was coming straight in. This time, Wallen never saw it. It came from his blind side. The explosion lifted both men off the ground. Wallen slammed onto his back in the ash. A second blast struck even closer. Fresh agony tore through his lower back and shoulders as hot metal punched through his dungarees and into muscle. O'Brien was unconscious, but still breathing. The plasma line had been ripped free. Blood soaked through the chest dressing. Wallen had to restart the four. He tried to sit up. Pain exploded through his torso. Something was wrong with his spine. Not severed. He could still feel his legs, but any movement sent lightning through his body. 2 riflemen had seen the blast and crawled forward. They wanted to evacuate both casualties immediately, Wallen and O'Brien together, before the next barrage landed. Wallen refused again. O'Brien had to go now. But Wallen could still function. His legs worked. His right eye worked. His hands worked. That was enough. The Marines stared at him as if he were insane. Blood streamed down his face from the shattered eye. Fresh blood soaked his back from the shrapnel wounds. He could barely sit upright, yet he was arguing to stay in the line. At 8:40, they carried O'Brien away. Wallen remained behind in the crater. He dumped sulfa powder over his shoulders as best he could reach, adding fresh wounds to an already growing list, and waited for the next call. He wrapped fresh battle dressings tight around his torso and kept moving. By 9 o'clock, Fox Company had clawed its way forward 200 yards, grinding to a halt at the base of Hill 362 Alpha. The ground ahead was alive with fire. Every cave mouth spat machine gun bursts. Every ravine concealed Japanese soldiers waiting with grenades. The casualty rate spiked sharply. Between 9 o'clock and 9:30, Wallen treated 6 more Marines. Most suffered shrapnel wounds. One man had lost a leg to a mine. Another gasped with a sucking chest wound. His plasma supply was nearly gone. His medical kit was almost empty. He kept working anyway. Across the island, corpsmen were being wiped out. In one battalion, 68% of medical personnel had been killed or wounded in the first week alone. Navy hospital corpsmen were dying at twice the rate of the riflemen they served. Still, every time someone screamed, "Corpsman," someone answered. At 9:45, battalion headquarters sent a message forward. Captain William Chambers came himself. He found Wallen and gave a direct order. Rearward. Now, this wasn't a suggestion. Wallen was wounded twice. He needed treatment. He needed evacuation. Wallen told him he would go after the attack ended. Fox Company was about to assault Hill 362 Alpha head-on. They would need every corpsman they had. He would leave once the hill was taken. Chambers didn't push it further. Corpsmen weren't ordinary Marines. They belonged to the Navy medical chain, and every one of them was a volunteer. If Wallen chose to die on that slope, it was his decision. The assault began at 10 o'clock. The Japanese had spent months turning Hill 362 Alpha into a fortress. Pillboxes dominated every approach. Interlocking machine gun fire made movement nearly impossible. Marines advanced 10 yards and lost men. Another 10 yards, more casualties. Wallen stayed with the assault wave. His back burned with every step. His left eye was useless, but his hands still functioned, and men were falling faster than ever. At 10:15, he reached Corporal Stephen Martinez, then Private James Wilson, then 3 more Marines cut down by crossing fire. He was treating the 5th casualty when a hand clamped onto his shoulder. Pharmacist's mate First Class Donald Mitchell, company headquarters. He had been sent for one purpose: pull Wallen off the line. Mitchell took one look at Wallen's shattered face and blood-soaked back. "That's it," he said. "We're done. We're leaving." No debate this time. Wallen had earned evacuation, but Wallen wasn't listening. He was staring past Mitchell, at something Mitchell hadn't seen yet. 200 yards ahead, a squad had stepped into a kill zone. Machine guns opened instantly. 6 Marines went down in the first 10 seconds. Fire from 3 positions converged on a patch of volcanic ash barely 100 square feet wide. The survivors dove into shallow craters that offered almost no protection at all. Mitchell grabbed Wallen's arm. They had to go. Now. Other corpsmen would handle it. Wallen yanked free and ran toward the gunfire. His back screamed. His vision blurred. Every step felt like tearing himself apart. But 6 Marines were bleeding out in the open, and no one was moving toward them. The other corpsmen were pinned down, or dead. Fox Company had already lost 3 medical personnel in the last hour. Mitchell watched Wallen charge into the kill zone. Then he followed. They reached the first casualty at 10:23. Private First Class Robert Davidson, 19 years old, Oregon. Multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen. Conscious, breathing, bleeding internally, and crashing fast. Wallen and Mitchell worked as one. Mitchell started the plasma. Wallen packed wounds. Japanese machine guns ripped the air above them. Bullets passed, so close they could feel the pressure of them. Neither man looked up. For minutes, Davidson stabilized. They moved to the next Marine. Then the next. 6 wounded men lay scattered across the kill zone. Wallen and Mitchell treated all 6 under continuous fire. Later, battalion logs would note the time. 17 minutes. 17 minutes exposed in a place no one was supposed to survive. At 10:45, flamethrower teams finally broke through the machine gun nests, smothering the firing positions in fire and smoke. What remained of Fox Company pulled back to regroup. In 7 days of fighting, battalion casualties had reached 240 men. One rifle company alone had lost 72% of its original strength. Mitchell got Wallen to the battalion aid station at 11 o'clock. Navy surgeons took one look at him and didn't hesitate. The eye wound was catastrophic. His back was riddled with shrapnel. He was prepped for evacuation immediately. They had him on a stretcher, moving toward the beach. Then Wallen climbed off. The surgeons stared in disbelief as he turned around and started walking back toward the front. He had been wounded twice in 4 hours. His left eye was destroyed. Metal was embedded in his back. He could barely walk in a straight line. And he was refusing evacuation again. Captain Chambers learned about it at 11:30. He pulled Wallen aside and asked him plainly what it would take. What injury would be serious enough to make you leave? Wallen didn't have an answer. He only knew that Fox Company was still fighting. The battle for Iwo Jima wasn't finished. As long as Marines were advancing, corpsmen had to be there. That was the job. That was what he had volunteered for. Chambers finally stopped trying to force the issue. Instead, he reassigned Wallen to the company command post. He would work from the aid station rather than running forward under fire, fewer bullets, less exposure. Wallen accepted the compromise. For the next 5 days, he treated casualties at the company aid station. His left eye never healed. The socket stayed swollen and inflamed. His back wounds grew infected despite repeated applications of sulfa powder. He kept working anyway. Between February 26th and March 2nd, Fox Company lost another 80 men. On March 2nd, new orders came down. Fox Company would assault the final defensive line before Katano Point. Japanese forces had concentrated what remained of their strength in caves and bunkers overlooking the northern coast. Intelligence estimated roughly 300 defenders in the sector. The estimate was wrong. There were closer to 800. The attack began at 7 o'clock. Within minutes, Fox Company ran into the heaviest defensive fire they had faced since landing. Mortars, artillery, machine guns firing from concealed positions no one had detected. Casualties exploded. The company aid station flooded with wounded faster than anyone could move them out. Wallen worked through the chaos, stabilizing men for evacuation. His back burned. His ruined eye throbbed. His hands kept moving, following procedures he knew by heart. At 8:30, a Japanese mortar round struck the aid station. The blast killed 2 Marines instantly and sent shrapnel into everyone within 20 feet. Metal tore into Wallen's lower back, the same place already wounded 6 days earlier. Fresh shrapnel on top of old damage. This time, even he couldn't ignore it. Fragments had driven deep into muscle near his spine. He couldn't stand upright. Every movement sent violent pain through his torso. But Fox Company was still engaged, and the next day would demand everything he had left. Navy surgeons made the decision for him. There would be no argument. Wallen was being evacuated to Guam. The injury was too severe. Without surgery, infection would kill him within days. At 9 o'clock on March 2nd, they placed him on a stretcher. 4 Marines carried him toward the beach, where landing craft waited to ferry casualties to hospital ships offshore. Wallen didn't resist this time. The pain had finally reached its limit. The stretcher team made it 300 yards before Fox Company's radio operator caught up with them at a run. Emergency traffic from the battalion commander. The assault on Katano Point had collapsed into disaster. Fox Company had taken 40% casualties in just 90 minutes. Every corpsman with the forward elements was dead or wounded. They needed Wallen back, immediately. The stretcher bearers froze. Then they looked down at him. Wallen was barely conscious, drifting in and out through pain and blood loss. His back dressings were already soaked through again. Turning him around and carrying him back into the fight was madness. Wallen forced himself to speak. Turn around. Fox Company needed a corpsman. He could still work. Get him back to the line. At 9:30, they reversed course. By 10 o'clock, Wallen was back at the company aid station, treating casualties despite wounds that should have put him aboard a hospital ship hours earlier. Other medical personnel couldn't comprehend it. He had been wounded twice in 6 days. Now wounded a 3rd time, and still refusing evacuation. The assault on Katano Point dragged on throughout March 2nd. Fox Company gained 200 yards at the cost of 63 casualties. Wallen treated 37 of them himself. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, flamethrower burns, traumatic amputations from buried mines. By nightfall, Fox Company was reduced to 97 men. They had landed on Iwo Jima with 240. In 11 days, nearly 60% were gone. Across the island, the 5th Marine Division had suffered 8,000 casualties, and the island was still not secured. That night, March 2nd, Wallen lay in agony. His back wounds were infected. Pus seeped through the dressings. His ruined left eye throbbed in time with his heartbeat. Fever shook his body. But dawn meant another assault. And Fox Company still needed a corpsman. March 3rd began at 6:30 with a Japanese artillery barrage. Enemy observers had found Fox Company's position overnight. High explosive shells marched through the Marine lines, killing and wounding men before the day's advance even began. At 7 o'clock, the assault toward Katano Point resumed. Fox Company moved across 600 yards of open ground. No cover, no concealment. Japanese defenders held elevated positions with perfect fields of fire. Every step forward cost blood. Wallen followed the assault element. He could barely stand upright. Pain tore through his back with each movement, but Marines were going down, and someone had to reach them. At 7:20, he treated 1 wounded rifleman, then another, then 3 more cut down by intersecting machine gun fire. At 7:45, an adjacent platoon was hit hard. Their corpsmen had been killed 2 days earlier. They had been fighting without medical support ever since. When men began to fall, they screamed for any corpsman who could hear them. Wallen heard. He moved toward them, across open ground swept by constant fire. Machine guns, mortars, rifle fire from a dozen concealed positions. Volcanic ash erupted around him as bullets slammed into the ground. He reached the platoon at 8 o'clock. 14 Marines were wounded, several critically. Many had been lying exposed for 20 minutes or more. Internal bleeding, arterial bleeding, sucking chest wounds. Without immediate care, half of them would die. Wallen went to work. First casualty. Second. Third. He moved methodically, triaging and treating. Plasma where needed, dressings packed tight, morphine for men slipping into shock. His training took over completely. The pain in his back faded into distant noise. The Japanese realized what was happening. Machine gun fire shifted. Mortars adjusted. Riflemen concentrated on the single man working in the open. Ash exploded around Wallen's position. He kept working. At 8:23, a Japanese sniper fired from an elevated position 300 yards away. The round struck Wallen's right leg just below the knee. The impact spun him around and drove him face first into the ash. His right leg collapsed beneath him. Bone and muscle were shattered. The femoral artery remained intact, but he couldn't stand. He couldn't walk. 12 wounded Marines still needed help. The nearest corpsman was 200 yards away. Wallen began to crawl. The volcanic ash burned exposed skin. He dragged himself forward using his elbows and one functioning leg. His injured leg carved a dark trail through the black sand. Every movement sent fresh agony through his infected back wounds. But 50 yards ahead, a wounded Marine was bleeding out. And without plasma, he would not survive. Private First Class Kenneth Morrison was 21, from Kansas. Shrapnel had torn into his abdomen and chest. He had been lying exposed for half an hour. Blood loss and shock were already shutting his body down. Without help in the next 10 minutes, he would die. Wallen crawled. 10 yards. 20. Japanese snipers saw the movement and adjusted their fire. Bullets cracked overhead. One round slammed into the ash 2 feet from Wallen's head. Another ripped through his pack, shattering his last bottles of plasma. He kept going. At 30 yards, his right leg went numb, complete loss of sensation below the knee. Nerve damage from the sniper round. The limb became dead weight, dragging behind him as he pulled forward with his arms alone. At 40 yards, a Japanese machine gun opened up. The gunner walked the fire in, ash exploding in a straight line, closing the distance with terrifying precision. Closer, closer. A Marine with a Browning automatic rifle finally suppressed the position long enough for Wallen to cover the final 10 yards. He reached Morrison at 8:35. The Marine was barely conscious. Pulse weak and thready. Breathing shallow. Classic hypovolemic shock. Morrison needed whole blood. Needed surgery. Needed a hospital. Wallen had none of that. He had sulfa powder. Battle dressings. Morphine. Training. And 3 weeks of combat experience on Iwo Jima. He packed the wounds. Gave morphine. Then pulled Morrison close, using his own body as a shield against incoming fire. Other corpsmen saw what was happening. Pharmacist's mate First Class James Chun had been working 200 yards away. He grabbed his kit and sprinted toward Wallen. Japanese fire intensified instantly. Chun made it 30 yards before machine gun bursts forced him into cover. Marines tried to suppress the guns, but the defenses were nearly perfect. Concrete pillboxes, steel doors that opened to fire and slammed shut again, overlapping fields of fire covering every approach. Colonel Nakagawa's defensive system was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. At 8:45, Fox Company's commander called for artillery. 15 minutes later, 105mm howitzers from 5th Marine Division artillery slammed into the Japanese line. High explosive shells marched across the ridge. Smoke, dust, and debris filled the air. Under the cover of the barrage, 4 Marines reached Wallen's position with a stretcher. They loaded Morrison first. Then they tried to load Wallen. He refused. There were still wounded men in the kill zone. 11 Marines he had treated earlier. They needed evacuation. Someone had to coordinate movement to the rear. The Marines argued for 10 seconds. Then they stopped. No one could reason with Wallen anymore. They had been trying for a week. He had been wounded 3 times and was still refusing to leave. Logic no longer applied. They carried Morrison away at 9 o'clock. Wallen stayed. His right leg was useless, his back burned with infection and shrapnel. His left eye socket throbbed with every heartbeat. But 11 Marines still needed help, and he was the only corpsman in position to give it. Between 9 o'clock and 9:30, stretcher teams evacuated 8 of the 11 wounded. The remaining 3 were already dead. Wallen had reached them too late. Arterial bleeding, massive trauma. Some wounds were beyond saving, no matter how skilled the hands. At 9:40, another corpsman finally arrived. Pharmacist's mate second-class Robert Hayes, the same man who had tried to pull Wallen off the line days earlier after the grenade blast. Hayes looked down at Wallen's shattered leg. He didn't say a word. None were needed. They both understood what had to happen next. At 9:50, Hayes eased Wallen onto a stretcher. This time, there was no argument. The corpsman had finally reached the limit of what his body could endure. 3 gunshot wounds, multiple shrapnel injuries, a right leg that would no longer bear weight, a destroyed left eye, a back ravaged by infection. 4 Marines lifted the stretcher and began moving toward the battalion aid station. Wallen lost consciousness halfway there. Blood loss and shock finally overtook him. By the time they reached medical personnel at 10:15, his pulse was faint, barely detectable. His blood pressure had collapsed. The doctors weren't certain he would survive the next hour. What they didn't know was that Wallen carried something no chart could measure. For a week, he had watched Marines fight through the impossible. He had seen men with catastrophic wounds refuse to quit. Somewhere in those hours under fire, he had learned a truth that medicine couldn't explain. Survival wasn't always about how badly you were hurt. Sometimes, it was about deciding you weren't finished yet. At 10:20 on March 3, 1945, Navy doctors began emergency treatment, unaware of just how much this young corpsman had already endured. Surgeons at the battalion aid station stabilized Wallen just enough for evacuation. By 11 o'clock, he was loaded onto a landing craft bound for a hospital ship offshore. USS Samaritan took him straight into surgery. 3 hours on the operating table. Shrapnel was removed from his leg and back. His left eye could not be saved. The grenade blast from February 26 had destroyed too much tissue. The numbers told the rest of the story. Between February 19 and March 3, Fox Company suffered 183 casualties. Wallen personally treated 67 Marines under fire. 14 of them were men he saved on March 3, after he had already been shot in the leg. All 14 survived. Medical officers later calculated that without Wallen's intervention, at least 9 would have died from blood loss before stretcher teams could reach them. The broader statistics were just as brutal. Of the 1,500 Navy corpsmen who landed on Iwo Jima, 332 were killed. Another 659 were wounded. Corpsmen died at nearly twice the rate of the Marines they served. Yet they kept answering the call. Wallen's story spread through the 5th Marine Division like an electrical current. 20 years old. Shot 3 times. Refused evacuation twice. Crawled 50 yards under fire to reach wounded Marines. Pharmacist's mate 3rd Class Donald Patterson heard the story while treating casualties with the 27th Marines. He had been considering a transfer to a rear area unit. After hearing what Wallen had done, he changed his mind. If Wallen could keep working after being shot 3 times, Patterson could finish his tour on the line. Similar decisions were made all across the division. One corpsman's refusal to quit became fuel for hundreds of others. Men who kept moving forward, one casualty at a time, through the worst fighting the Pacific War had to offer. Exhausted corpsmen found strength they didn't know they had left. A 20-year-old from Utah had shown them what was possible when you simply refused to stop. George Wallen spent the next 9 months in military hospitals, Guam, Hawaii, Oakland Naval Hospital. Surgery after surgery, physical therapy, and nights filled with the same dreams. Marines screaming for a corpsman, grenade blasts echoing in his skull, the metallic smell of blood mixed with volcanic ash. Then something unexpected arrived. On October 5, 1945, George Wallen stood on the south lawn of the White House. President Harry Truman stepped forward to present the Medal of Honor. 14 servicemen received the medal that day, all for actions on Iwo Jima. Truman read Wallen's citation aloud. Wounded 3 times. Refused evacuation twice. Crawled 50 yards with a useless leg to save 14 Marines under continuous fire. Wallen answered reporters' questions politely, briefly. He didn't see himself as a hero. The real heroes, he said, were the Marines who never left Iwo Jima and the corpsmen who didn't come home. Over time, the nightmares began to fade. Meeting his future wife, Melba, helped. They married in 1946. After the wedding, the dreams finally stopped. In 1948, Wallen re-enlisted, this time in the United States Army, serving as a medical technician. He went to Korea, then Vietnam, returning to combat in 1967 as a medical officer. He was wounded again, earning his fourth Purple Heart. After 20 years across 3 wars, he retired in 1968. He spent the next decade working for the Veterans Administration, caring for the same kind of men he had once dragged out of gunfire. In 2004, President George W. Bush signed legislation renaming the Salt Lake City VA Medical Center in his honor. Federal buildings are rarely named after living individuals. Congress made an exception. George Wallen passed away on June 5, 2009, at the age of 84, Utah's last living Medal of Honor recipient. More than 2,000 people attended his memorial service. 4 Navy corpsmen received the Medal of Honor for Iwo Jima. 2 were killed in combat. 2 survived. Together, they showed an entire generation what was possible when you refused to accept that wounded men were already lost. 14 Marines lived on March 3, 1945, because a 20-year-old corpsman crawled 50 yards with a bullet in his leg. And for the next 80 years, thousands of corpsmen learned, from his example, what devotion to duty truly looks like.